There's something you keep not doing, isn't there? Something you know matters, something you've committed to 100 times, something that would genuinely change the shape of your life if you just do it consistently. And you do it for a while. You show up for a few days, maybe a week, maybe even a month if the stars align. And then something happens. Life interrupts. You miss a day, and somehow that one missed day becomes 2 days, and 2 days becomes a week, and suddenly you're back at zero, wondering how you got here again, wondering why you can't seem to maintain the one thing you know would help. And there's this particular pain that comes with that cycle. Not the sharp pain of outright failure, but the dull, grinding pain of almost succeeding over and over, of being someone who keeps starting but never quite sustaining, of knowing exactly what you need to do and watching yourself not do it, like you're observing your own life from a slight distance, unable to quite inhabit it fully. And underneath all of that is this question, quietly persistent, that you might be afraid to ask directly. What's wrong with me? Why can't I just show up? Why does something so simple feel so impossible? What if I told you that the question itself is the problem? What if there's nothing wrong with you? What if the struggle to show up every day isn't evidence of some fundamental flaw in your character, but evidence that you've been misunderstanding what showing up actually means? What if you've been trying to show up perfectly, dramatically, completely, and that very attempt at perfection is what's making consistency impossible? What if showing up every day doesn't look the way you think it looks? What if it's not about grand gestures or peak performances or maintaining some pristine streak? What if it's something much quieter, much more forgiving, much more available to you right now exactly as you are? And what if that quiet, humble, imperfect showing up, when done consistently over time, when done even when you don't want to, even when you're broken, even when you have almost nothing to give, what if that's actually the most powerful force available to any human being? What if showing up every day, in whatever form you can manage, is the single practice that underlies every meaningful transformation, every great work, every life that looks, from the outside, like it was somehow blessed or gifted or special? Let me explore this with you slowly, because there are layers here that reward patience. Showing up every day sounds simple, almost too simple. It sounds like advice a child could understand. Just do the thing. Just be there. What's complicated about that? But the simplicity is deceptive, because what seems simple is often what's most profound, most difficult, most resistant to our tendency to overthink and overcomplicate. The simple things are hard not because they require complex skills, but because they require something rarer. Consistency, commitment, the willingness to return to something day after day, not because it's always exciting, not because it always feels meaningful, but because you decided it mattered and you're honoring that decision with your presence. And that honoring, that daily renewal of commitment through action, that's where everything changes. Not in the dramatic moments, not in the inspired bursts, but in the ordinary, unremarkable showing up that nobody sees, that nobody celebrates, that feels like nothing while it's happening, but accumulates into everything over time. Think about tides. The ocean doesn't crash against the shore with theatrical intensity every single day. Sometimes the waves are dramatic, sometimes they're barely noticeable, but the tide comes in and goes out every day, without fail. Every single day. It doesn't skip a Tuesday because Tuesday was difficult. It doesn't take a break because it hasn't been feeling motivated. The tide shows up, and over millions of years, that daily showing up has shaped continents, it's carved coastlines, it's created beaches and cliffs and valleys that look like they could only have been formed by some massive, violent force. But they weren't. They were formed by water, touching land, every single day, with nothing more than its ordinary presence. That's what daily showing up creates, not through force, not through intensity, but through presence. Through the simple, patient, persistent reality of being there. And you have that same power available to you, not the dramatic power of a single heroic effort, but the quiet, inexorable power of daily presence applied to something that matters. Now let's talk about what actually happens when you show up every day. Not what you think should happen, not the results you're hoping for, but what actually happens in the structure of who you are. When you show up every day, you're doing something at a much deeper level than just practicing a skill or working toward a goal. You're encoding a new identity. You're telling your nervous system, your subconscious, your entire psychological architecture, this is who I am. Not who I'm trying to be, not who I hope to become someday. Who I am right now, I'm someone who does this. And that identity encoding, it's cumulative. Each time you show up, you're adding another data point to the evidence your system uses to define you. And gradually, through the accumulation of these data points, the definition shifts. You stop being someone who's trying to meditate and become a meditator. You stop being someone who's trying to write and become a writer. You stop being someone who's trying to exercise and become someone who exercises. And that shift in identity, that quiet recognition of yourself as someone who shows up, that changes what feels natural, what feels automatic, what feels like you. And once something feels like you don't have to force it anymore. You don't have to motivate yourself to do it. You just do it. Because not doing it would feel like a betrayal of who you are. But here's what's important about this process. It's not linear. It doesn't happen according to your timeline. You don't show up for 30 days and suddenly have a solid identity as someone who shows up. It's more like water wearing stone, gradual, invisible, and then suddenly undeniable. You're showing up day after day, and it seems like nothing is changing. You're still fighting the same resistance. You're still negotiating with yourself every morning. You still don't always want to do it. And then one day, you notice something. The negotiation is a little shorter. The resistance is a little softer. The thing you've been doing starts to feel more like yours. And it wasn't a dramatic shift. It was just the quiet accumulation of all those days reaching a threshold. All that water finally carving its mark in the stone. And that's what you're building toward. Not a single breakthrough, but a threshold. A point at which who you are has genuinely shifted. And you can't get to that threshold by counting days and judging progress. You get there by just showing up day after day after day, trusting that the threshold will come even when you can't see it approaching. There's something I want to explore about the quality of showing up, because I think we carry an idea that showing up only counts if it's done fully, if we're fully engaged, fully energized, at our best. If we're not at our best, if we're tired or sad or distracted or going through the motions, then it doesn't really count. We've told ourselves this story, and it's a destructive one, because it sets up a binary where you either show up properly or you might as well not show up at all. And that binary is what creates the all or nothing thinking that breaks consistency. If you can't do it right, you don't do it. And so the days when you most need the practice, the days when you're struggling, when you have the least energy, when showing up would be most powerful precisely because it's hardest, those are the days you skip. Because those are the days when you can't show up perfectly. But perfect showing up is a fantasy. It's a standard you've invented that nature never asked of you. The tide doesn't show up perfectly. Sometimes it's gentle, sometimes it's fierce. But it shows up. It's present. It touches the shore. And that's all showing up requires. Presence. Not perfection, not performance, just presence. A 5-minute meditation when you're exhausted and your mind won't stop is worth more than an hour-long session when conditions are perfect. Because the difficult showing up is the one that builds real muscle. It's the one that proves to your system that you're serious, that you're not just doing this when it's easy, that you're committed regardless of conditions. And that conditionless commitment, that's what creates the unshakable quality of genuine practice. When you've shown up enough times in the difficult moments, when you've proven to yourself that your practice doesn't require you to feel good or be ready or have enough time, you develop a relationship with it that can't be broken by circumstance, because you've already survived every circumstance. You've already shown up tired and sad and busy and overwhelmed. You've already proven that none of those things stop you. And now when those things come, and they will come, because that's what life does, they don't threaten your practice. They're just conditions, and you show up anyway. Let me speak about resistance for a while, because resistance is the constant companion of daily practice, and you need to understand it. Every single person who has ever built a meaningful practice has faced resistance. Every writer who has sat down to write has felt the pull to do something else instead. Every meditator who has sat on the cushion has had days where their mind refused to settle. Every athlete who has trained has had mornings where the bed felt impossibly comfortable and the training felt impossibly difficult. Resistance is not evidence that you're doing the wrong thing. Resistance is the price of doing the right thing. It's the friction that proves you're at an edge, that you're trying to grow beyond your current limits, that you're doing something that matters enough to be worth resisting. If there were no resistance, you'd already be past this stage. You'd already be comfortable here. The resistance is how you know you're still in growth territory. And the way to work with resistance is not to overpower it, but to see through it, to recognize it as a predictable feature of the landscape, rather than a unique and devastating obstacle. Resistance shows up every day, and every day you can acknowledge it, thank it for its consistency, and show up anyway. Not fighting it, just not obeying it. There's a particular experience that happens in practice that I want to name. It's the experience of resistance dissolving mid-practice. You start the thing you're doing, and you don't want to be doing it. Your mind is complaining. Your body is reluctant. Every part of you wants to stop. But you stay with it. You keep going. And somewhere in the middle, something shifts. The resistance softens. The quality of your attention changes. You start to actually be here instead of wishing you were somewhere else. And the practice becomes real, alive, sometimes even joyful. This is the gift that only comes to those who show up even when they don't want to. Because if you'd quit when the resistance was high, if you'd left when you didn't want to be there, you'd never have reached this moment. The moment when showing up is rewarded not by results or recognition, but by the immediate experience of being present with something that matters. And once you've felt that enough times, once you've experienced the gift that lives on the other side of resistance enough times, you start to trust it. You start to know that if you just get through the beginning, if you just stay long enough, something will open. Not always, not every time, but often enough to make the showing up feel like a worthwhile gamble. Now let's talk about what daily showing up does to time. This is subtle but profound. When you're not showing up consistently, when your practice is sporadic, when you're doing things occasionally and randomly, time feels like an enemy. It slips away. You look back and wonder where the days went, why you have nothing to show for them. Time feels scarce, like it's running out, because you're not using it intentionally. You're not putting yourself in a consistent relationship with it. But when you show up every day, when you have a practice that anchors each day, something shifts in your relationship with time. Time becomes your ally, because each day you're doing something. Each day adds something to the accumulation. Each day is not just a day that passed, but a day that contributed. And over time, looking back, instead of the blur of days that went nowhere, you have this sense of a river of days. each one flowing into the next, each one doing its small part to carry you forward. And that sense of purposeful relationship with time, that feeling that your days are going somewhere, that creates a quality of peace, a settledness, a sense that even though you don't know exactly where things are going, you're in relationship with your own life. You're not watching it happen to you. You're participating in it, shaping it, one day at a time. There's something deeply important about the regularity of daily practice that goes beyond strategy. It's almost sacred. When you commit to showing up every day, you're making an agreement with something larger than your momentary preferences. You're saying, regardless of how I feel, regardless of what else is happening, this is what I do, this is who I am. And that agreement held day after day becomes something like a container, a vessel, a shape that your energy can fill. Without it, your energy dissipates. It goes wherever the wind blows, wherever distraction pulls, wherever comfort leads. But with the container of daily practice, your energy has somewhere to go, something to fill. And that filling, that daily pouring of yourself into something consistent, that's how things are made, how skills are built, how lives are shaped, not by having a clear vision of the destination, but by showing up to the practice every day and trusting that the practice knows where it's going, even when you don't. And here's something worth sitting with. You don't always need to know why you're showing up. There will be days when the practice feels meaningless, when you're writing and the writing feels hollow, when you're meditating and you feel like you're getting nowhere, when you're doing whatever your practice is and you genuinely can't see the point. And on those days, you show up anyway. Not because you have clarity about why, but because you made an agreement, and you honor the agreement. Not the outcome, not the feeling, not the meaning. The agreement. I said I would do this, and I'm doing it. And that honoring, that pure integrity between your word and your action, that's what builds character. Not inspiration, not motivation, not understanding, just doing what you said you'd do. And over time, that character becomes your foundation, the solid ground from which everything else grows. Because you know, in the most direct and undeniable way, that you can count on yourself, that your word means something to you. And that knowledge, that self-trust, it's not something you can get any other way. You can't think your way into it. You can't convince yourself of it. You can only build it day by day, through the practice of showing up. Let's explore what showing up does to your relationship with fear. Because most of the things we're not doing, the practices we're not maintaining, the lives we're not living, they're not blocked by inability. They're blocked by fear. Fear that we'll fail. Fear that we're not good enough. Fear that if we really try and it doesn't work, we'll have proven something terrible about ourselves. And so we don't try consistently. We try occasionally, tentatively, in ways we can walk away from without too much investment. We protect ourselves from commitment because commitment means exposure, and exposure means risk. But when you show up every day, something interesting happens to that fear. It doesn't disappear, but it becomes less important because you're facing it every day. Not in some dramatic confrontation, but in the small, quiet act of showing up to the thing you're afraid of failing at. You're saying, I'm here, I'm doing this, even though I might fail, even though I might not be good enough, I'm here anyway. And after you've done that enough times, after you've shown up in the face of fear, day after day after day, the fear changes its quality. It's still there. You still feel it, but it no longer stops you. Because you've proven, with evidence, that you can act despite it, that you can be afraid and show up anyway. And that's all courage is, not the absence of fear, but the presence of showing up alongside it. Now let's talk about what happens to your work when you show up every day. Not just the volume, which obviously increases, but the quality. There's a quality that's only accessible through daily practice, a depth, a nuance, a kind of intimacy with your work that only comes from spending time with it every day. When you're in daily relationship with something, you start to see things you couldn't see when you were visiting it occasionally. You start to notice patterns, subtleties. The thing starts to reveal itself to you in ways it wouldn't if you were only showing up when convenient. It's like the difference between visiting a city occasionally and living there. When you visit, you see the surface, the landmarks, the obvious things. But when you live there, when you're there every day, you start to know it. The rhythms, the hidden places, the way the light falls in the late afternoon. You develop a relationship with it, and your work is the same. When you show up every day, you enter into a relationship with it. And it starts to give you things, insights, breakthroughs, surprising turns, things you couldn't have planned or predicted but that only became available because you were there, because you kept showing up, because you created the conditions for those gifts to emerge. There's a particular kind of day I want to acknowledge. The day when everything feels wrong, when you've slept badly, when something difficult happened, when your mind is cluttered and your body is heavy, and the last thing in the world you want to do is your practice, and you do it anyway. You show up, badly, reluctantly. You do the bare minimum. You write 3 sentences. You meditate for 3 minutes. You do 1 push-up or 1 stretch or whatever the smallest version of your practice looks like. And you might be tempted to dismiss that, to think that doesn't count, but it's the most important showing up you'll do. Because it proves something. It proves that your practice doesn't depend on conditions. It proves that you're not fair weather in your commitment. It proves that even on the worst days, even when you have nothing to give, you still give what you have. And that quality, that willingness to show up with whatever is available, even if it's almost nothing, that's what makes a practice unbreakable. Because if your practice only happens when conditions are right, it's fragile. 1 bad week can destroy it. But if your practice happens on bad days too, on the worst days too, it's resilient. It can survive anything. And that resilience is what allows it to compound over years, over decades, into something remarkable. Let's think about the relationship between showing up and surrender, because these might seem like opposites. Showing up sounds active, effortful, disciplined. Surrender sounds passive, effortless, released. But they're actually the same thing expressed differently. When you show up every day, when you maintain your practice not out of force or grinding willpower, but out of genuine commitment to something larger than your momentary preferences, you're surrendering. You're surrendering your resistance, your excuses, your need for perfect conditions. You're surrendering the story that today is different, that today is the exception, that today you deserve to not show up. You're surrendering the ego's endless negotiation in favor of the simple clarity of your commitment. And that surrender, that release of all the arguments and exceptions and special cases, that's what makes showing up effortless eventually. Not immediately, not in the beginning, but over time, as the practice becomes more deeply yours, as the identity settles, as the habit takes root, it stops being something you force yourself to do. It becomes something you just do, like breathing, like eating, like all the things you do without deciding to do them because they're part of who you are. And here's what's paradoxical about this. The days when you most want to surrender to rest, to skip, to give yourself a break, those are often the days when showing up would give you the most. Because the resistance you feel on those days is often not physical tiredness. It's emotional or psychological heaviness, some difficulty you're carrying, some weight that's pulling you down. And movement, practice, engagement with your work often dissolves that weight better than avoiding it. Not always, but often enough. You sit down to write on the day you least want to write, and something shifts. The heaviness lightens. You find yourself saying something on the page that needed to be said, something you didn't know you were carrying. And the practice, your daily showing up, It becomes the space where you process your life, where you metabolize your experiences, where you discover what you think and feel and are. Not through therapy or journaling specifically, but through whatever your practice is, through being consistently in relationship with something that requires your honest presence. And that function, that space for authentic processing, it's one of the most valuable things daily showing up creates. Not the skill, not the output, but the ongoing conversation between you and your work, the space where you become known to yourself. So how do you actually do this? How do you build this quality of daily showing up? Not through grand resolution, not through dramatic commitment, not by deciding you're going to be perfect from now on, but by making the smallest possible commitment and then keeping it, by choosing a version of your practice so small it's almost embarrassing, and then doing that small version every day without exception, and by understanding deeply that the small version is not a lesser version, it is the version. Because showing up imperfectly, showing up minimally, showing up with almost nothing, that is still showing up. And showing up is everything. The size of the action matters far less than the fact of the action. The quality of the session matters far less than the occurrence of the session. You write one paragraph and it's nothing special. You showed up, you meditated for 5 minutes and your mind wandered the whole time. You showed up, you exercised for 10 minutes and it wasn't even hard. You showed up, and all those showings up, all those days of being there, they accumulate, they build the identity, they create the momentum, they compound into the transformation that couldn't happen any other way. If these words are landing somewhere in you, if something here is touching the place where you know you need to show up more consistently, I want to invite you to do something small right now. Like this video, subscribe to this channel. Not because I need it, though it genuinely helps, but as a practice. As a small act of showing up for the exploration of ideas that matter to you. As evidence to yourself that you can make a small commitment and act on it immediately rather than later, someday, when you feel more ready. And if you want to keep exploring these themes, if you want more reflections on how to build a life through the quiet power of daily presence, this channel is here for that. This is a space for people who are done with dramatic promises and ready for consistent practice, who understand that the power isn't in the peak moments, it's in the ordinary ones, the unremarkable Tuesday when you showed up anyway. That Tuesday is what changes everything. As we close, I want to leave you with something simple to carry. You don't have to change everything today. You don't have to become someone new overnight. You don't have to have it all figured out. You just have to show up once, today, in whatever form you can manage. Maybe it's the full version of your practice. Maybe it's the minimum. Maybe it's the whisper of the practice, barely recognizable as the thing you intended. It doesn't matter. Show up. Be there. Do the small thing. And then tomorrow show up again. And the day after, again. Not because you know exactly where it's going. Not because you have certainty about the outcome, but because you've decided this matters, and you're choosing to honor that decision with your presence every day. In the small and ordinary way that great things are built. That's the power. Not in the dramatic decision to change, but in the quiet daily choice to show up. You already know you can do this. You've shown up before, and you're here right now. Which means you're already doing it. You're already in the practice. You're already showing up. So keep going. Tomorrow, keep going. The day after, keep going. One day at a time. One showing up at a time. That's all. That's everything. That's the whole practice. And it's enough. You're enough. Just show up and let that be sufficient. Because it is. It always has been. It always will be.